Me. Just want to check in before I get started.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay. I am Kate McClellan Press with NYSERDA's Environmental Research Program, and I'm really pleased to have supported the 2020 State of the Science workshop on offshore wind and wildlife on cumulative impacts. Before we begin today, I'm just going to go over some logistics. This meeting is being recorded. Everyone except panelists has been muted, and we don't have video. But we just want to make you all aware that it is recorded. We will be making a link to the recording available on the Environmental Technical Working Group website, and we'll send out an email with the link following the webinar. We will also post the slides on that site. If you have any questions or technical troubles during the webinar, please contact Ashley Arrayas at the CADMIS group. Her email is on the screen now. And you could also send her a direct message in the chat function. Please ask questions for the panelists using the Q&A. You can also use this tool to upvote questions that you'd like to see answered. We probably won't have time to answer everyone's questions, but we will try our best. We will also make sure that we save the list of questions until after the webinar, and we'll do our best to get answers to those questions to those that we don't get to today. You can also use the chat function to engage with each other and provide feedback to the panelists and to us during the webinar. And also, if you want to, you can rename yourself after logging into Zoom. You can do that by hovering over your name in the participants list and changing your name to first name and last name, and you can include your organization there as well. And just a reminder that all attendees, except for the panelists, are muted and have their video turned off. Okay, so I and Kate Williams are going to start off today by reviewing the goals and the outcomes of the State of the Science workshop and what we have asked the work groups to do and what they'll be presenting on today. Each work group lead will briefly present the key take-home messages and a few of the top priority topics that were identified by the work groups. We should have a few minutes for questions after each presenter, so please put your questions into the Q&A. We probably, again, won't have time to answer all of those questions, and we'll save the questions submitted through the Q&A and work with the work group leads to try to get them answered via email after the meeting. Following the presentations from each of the 7 work groups, we'll have a panel discussion focused on synthesizing and understanding linkages among the different groups. If you would like to, oh, sorry, Kate, next slide. If you would like to contact any of us at the Environmental Research Program, my contact information is available, and Kate Williams, who is the technical lead for NYSERDA's Environmental Technical Working Group, is also here. And then the head of the Environmental Research Program is Gregory Lampman. And please, if you have any questions following this, feel free to contact any of us. Next slide. I get to do the thank yous, which I'm so privileged to do. First, I would like to thank the Environmental Technical Working Group and the State of the Science Planning Committee for hosting a great 2020 State of the Science, as well as everyone who participated in that November workshop. This virtual webinar and the working group meetings also could not have happened without the support of the CADMIS group and the event staff at NYSERDA. In addition, the Biodiversity Research Institute with Kate Williams, Ed Jenkins, and Julia Golka have really led the entire State of the Science effort and the working groups over the last more than 1 year of putting this whole effort together, providing both logistical support, learning entirely new programs, and also providing their technical knowledge and expertise along the way. And so an enormous thank you to them, and also a virtual round of applause. We'd also all like to thank the working group members who have put in their time and insights and review throughout the process. This was a planned, I think, 1-day in-person meeting, which has turned into many virtual meetings over the last few months and an enormous amount of engagement. And lastly, we owe the work group leads so much thanks. They drove the conversations, and the work group reports that you're about to hear about through their expertise, and are truly responsible for the success of this effort. Next slide. As most of you are aware, this follows the plenary session of the State of the Science that was held in November. It was, we like to say, the largest known gathering of to discuss offshore wind and wildlife. We had 9 sessions and more than 40 speakers, and an impressive attendance from around the world, and a lot of virtual engagement, which we really hope to learn from when we are able to start meeting in person again. And since we have last met, there have been significant milestones achieved by US offshore wind projects, as well as the identification of new proposed lease areas off the US East Coast. And we really hope that the discussions and reports that each of the working groups has conducted can further inform environmentally responsible development and help us better understand how we measure the effects as the industry progresses. And today we had over 500 people register for this concluding session, and we hope that we can continue to engage with you as the workshop reports are released, and at the next State of the Science meeting. And I think with that, I get to turn things over to Kate Williams.
Great, thanks, Kate. And thank you all for being here today. So as a reminder, the goal for the State of the Science workshop and these related work groups was to better understand, and in the long term eventually be able to help avoid cumulative impacts to wildlife from offshore wind development. And so the November workshop is really about sharing information, understanding the state of knowledge around assessing cumulative impacts. And then these work groups that have met over the winter have been trying to identify some discrete studies that could be undertaken in the next 5 years to help sort of lay the groundwork to improve our understanding of cumulative impacts in the longer term as the industry develops in the United States. So just as a reminder, we're focused on the science, so biological cumulative impacts. We're not thinking about cumulative impacts so much from a regulatory perspective. We're focused on the science. That does obviously include baseline health and status of populations and ecosystems, since that often is necessary information to understand cumulative impacts from a specific stressor. And we also focus conversations specifically around impacts from offshore wind. So that doesn't mean that offshore wind is causing more impacts than a variety of other stressors in the marine system. It's more that we needed to set some reasonable bounds for discussion, basically. And cumulative impact assessments in relation to offshore wind obviously can feed into broader cumulative effects frameworks in the long term that include impacts from multiple stressors, which is kind of the end goal. So we had 7 work groups, and the goal for each work group was to identify a short list of key studies that could be initiated in the next 5 years to improve our understanding of cumulative biological impacts as the offshore wind industry develops in the eastern United States. So the outcome wasn't necessarily as formal as like a research agenda, but trying to have these groups of knowledgeable experts identify research needs, and then with the hope that that would sort of inform decisions, both by potential funding organizations as well as researchers, about where to sort of focus efforts and allocate resources in the coming years. And so the 7 groups were benthos, fishes and aquatic invertebrates, marine mammals, birds, sea turtles, bats, and what we called environmental change, which was looking at potential changes in the abiotic environment, like physical and oceanographic conditions. Each group had 1 to 3 leaders who guided group discussions and took the lead on developing the work group reports. You'll hear from 1 to 2 leads per group today, so not everyone who was helping lead a group is going to be speaking, but there's been a very concerted effort from everyone listed here to really help lead these groups and pull together the reports, and it's been a really fantastic effort, and everyone's put a lot of time and energy into it over the last 6 months or so into making these work groups as effective and successful as possible. We also, as Kate said, have a lot of work group members who have volunteered their time and been involved in that process, somewhere between 27 and 83 members per group who either were participating in meetings or providing written comments on reports or both. And so we've been a pretty incredible effort, and we're really grateful for everyone's involvement. So just briefly, a quick overview of the general work group process. It did vary somewhat from group to group, but each group had several virtual meetings over this past winter. The work group leads first reviewed pre-existing data and existing efforts to identify priorities. Then the group members all work together to try to identify key gaps and research needs. Then the group leads develop sort of draft research priorities based on work group discussions. And then the groups went through this sort of collaborative process of expanding upon each priority topic, further describing what they had in mind, and then also refining the list of top priorities. Like sometimes it was a pretty long list of topics that the groups came up with, and so trying to refine down and identify what the real top priorities are in the immediate term in the next 5 years. The work group reports are still in progress, but we are developing a report from each work group that lays out those short-term research priorities. And then in addition to those the work group reports being published independently, we're also going to be referencing them and sort of synthesizing across all 7 work groups in the workshop proceedings document that's going to be released by NYSERDA later this year. So 5 of the 7 draft reports are pretty close to final, and so they are currently posted on the workshop website for viewing. They're not available to download yet. We're going to make them available for download once they're officially finalized, which will be in June. And we'll send out an email blast to you all and let you know when those final reports are available. But as I said, 5 of the 7 are actually available for viewing on the eTwig website at that link right now. So now each of the work group leads are going to briefly discuss the key outcomes from their work groups. There'll be a few minutes, as Kate said, for Q&A after each presentation. So remember to get your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom. If you could not put your questions in the chat, please put them in the Q&A so that other people can see them and upvote questions that they're interested in hearing the answers to as well. We'll do brief presentations, a couple minutes for Q&A in between each one, and then end with a panel discussion among the work group leads. So first up, we have Jeff Carpenter from the Institute for Coastal Research at the Helmholtz Center for Resilience and Innovation in Germany. I hope I got that affiliation somewhat correct, Jeff. And Jeff's going to be talking about outcomes from the environmental change work group.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yeah, we just changed our name like a month ago, so I'm still learning it myself, actually. Okay, so this working group was focused on environmental change, or in other words, physical changes that are expected to occur due to the presence of offshore wind farms. Next slide, please. Oh, and it says stratification up there because this is one, I'll discuss this in a moment, but this is probably the biggest focus that we spent our time on, and we felt where the biggest impact could be made in the short term. But we decided that there were a number of processes and variables that needed to be studied that changed the physical environment. These were changes in stratification that we expect might occur due to the presence of the wind farms. And closely associated with this are changes in turbulence levels, suspended sediment levels, and also the processes involved in the wind and the ocean wake effects, which involve all of these variables above, or changes in these variables above. So it's the structures themselves that are impacting the physical processes, and these will have knock-on or follow-up effects that are felt throughout the ecosystem, all the way up, we expect, to the highest trophic levels. And so we also focused on the effects that we thought would have the largest impact on some of the other topics that are being discussed in this workshop. We have identified 6 short-term priorities in total. Next slide, please. Okay, some key take-home messages were first, we spent a lot of time discussing what sort of monitoring strategies should be employed, or how monitoring strategies will change with the building of the farms. And we felt like it was really important to have a coordinated and sort of longer term monitoring strategy in place, and understand what changes need to be made to that monitoring strategy in order to understand some of these impacts, some of these physical impacts, and also the related biological impacts. Some of the highest priority topics that we identified, we tried to link to having an ecological importance, as I said, and it really highlighted the need of developing sort of metrics and methods to understand these changes as well. And maybe one thing I should say, or should have already said, is that the state of research right now in the physical impacts of offshore wind farms is really at a very, very beginning stage. So there's really a lot that's not known. And I think we're still, and I'll discuss this more in a moment, we're still in the stage where we need to understand what we need to understand. So this sort of permeates everything I'm going to say. And then also, as these monitoring strategies and these studies are beginning to be done, we felt it's really important to have a sort of coordination of the research and the data collection, so that everybody can benefit from that, and that's all in a sort of central spot. So that was also something we identified as a really important take-home message. Next slide, please. Okay, here are the short-term research topics. Some of them are actually not really research topics, but we found them important topics that would lead to advances in research. And they're in no real particular order, I have to say. The first was to develop some methods and metrics to document what short and long-term monitoring should be done and how it should be done, and how it should be different in the farms before they're built, after they're built, and how it links to both understanding the changes that are happening in the farms and separating those from the natural variability, and also possibly the climate variability and climate change that's occurring on top of all these changes that we're discussing. And then to use, in the end, we think that this will best be understood, at least the physical impacts and how they cascade up onto the biology, by employing an integrated modeling approach. So being able to put these physical changes into models that also link to the biology. We felt like this was the best way to sort of provide this direct link between the physical impacts and biology. Okay, and then to formalize a coordination of existing efforts to maximize the utility of available resources. Basically what we had in mind here was more of, and this is not so much a research topic, but more of a support device so that researchers can sort of have a platform where they can discuss and collaborate these effects with each other. So this was what I discussed in the last slide, really having a sort of centralized spot where these discussions and this data, this research can take place. We don't know exactly which form that should take, but we feel like it's important that something is there. Okay, we felt like because the research is also in a very early stage, that there's a lot of very short-term impactful studies that can be done that are really just basically feasibility studies to understand what physical impacts are important and where energy should be focused in the sort of longer-term strategy for understanding these impacts. And then, as I mentioned, we felt like the changes that might occur due to the farms affecting stratification are really where we see the strongest link between the physical changes within the farms and the cascading effects on biology. So the stratification on the east coast of the US is quite unique and extremely strong, and has a very important role for the biology there. So we don't know yet what impacts this will have on the stratification. We felt like this was probably the biggest entirely scientific topic to be addressed. And then the last one that I just want to mention was a bit of an uncertain one. We think it is likely important in European seas, but probably not so important on the east coast of the US, and that is assessing changes in light conditions. Specifically, we were thinking about the resuspension of sediment due to altered turbulence levels from the foundation structures, and whether or not this would have an impact directly on biology through the altered light conditions. Okay, thank you. I think that's all I wanted to say.
Great, thanks, Jeff. It looks like we have a couple of questions in the Q&A if you want to pull that up and take a look at those.
Okay, sure. Would these challenges with stratification be only present in shallow waters or also in deeper waters where you would have offshore wind floating platforms? Actually, you would only find, well, okay, I should be careful here. Because I'm so used to European seas, at least in the North Sea, you would only expect to see stratification in deeper waters, because in shallower waters with tidal effects, you have a strong mixing that can mix the entire water column up. So you often only find stratification in deeper waters. So that actually answers part of your question. And with the floating platforms, yeah, this is also something we discussed. Yeah, things will change a lot with floating platforms, and it could be that the priorities that we identified should be shifted around, and maybe some of them are not even relevant. So yeah, that's a good question. I can't answer that really, because the floating platforms are so new, actually, but it's something that is discussed. Okay, how many years of data do you think would be needed to separate the effects of climate change from the offshore wind farms? Yeah, good questions. I can't, like you said here, actually, it's difficult to say because the conditions are so variable. So it's really difficult. I think one strategy would be to use process studies, which I guess has been done so far, to run idealized modeling with some of the observational data used as input, so you can separate out these things, separate out the effects of say a single foundation structure. So that's a strategy that's been used so far. Okay, and then I see one more question here. Can you give us some sense of timescale for short versus long term? In what sense? You mean the short-term research priorities, or the long-term research priorities, or are you talking more of a physical scale? I guess the short-term research scale that we were given was like 3 to 5 years, if that was your question.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jeff. That was terrific.
Okay.
I think let's move on to our next presenter. Stephen Digger and Zoe Hutchison are, I think, sort of splitting efforts today for the Benthos work group. So Zoe is with the University of St. Andrews, and she'll be presenting the outcomes from the Benthos work group. And then Stephen Digger from the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences is going to be participating in the panel discussion at the end of the webinar. So Zoe, take it away.
Thank you. Yep, thanks for the introduction. So we can just move straight on to the next slide, please. Okay, so the Benthos working group focused on a kind of broad scale benthic system, which has a very strong influence in the functioning of marine ecosystems, largely due to the fact that it accounts for approximately half of the ecosystem. So to date, there is a substantial body of literature which summarises the benthic effects of offshore wind on the benthos. And that literature also highlights that there's a large number of questions that still remain to be answered or to be more fully understood. So to make sure that we were trying to think about the pressures and changes to the benthic ecosystem in like a broad sense of cumulative effects, we used the 3 dimensions that are shown here on the right-hand side. So in dimension 1, you can see that we addressed the pressure type. So we identified that as the artificial reef effect, the mechanical seafloor disturbance, and also the introduction of energy, which includes sound, electromagnetic fields, and heat. Although this group only focused efforts on electromagnetic fields and heat because Art Popper's group was looking at sound in much more depth. In dimension 2, you can see that the ecological theme, we split that up into ecosystem structure and function. So in terms of ecosystem structure, you could think about it in terms of changes in the community structure of species or the distributional patterns over space and time. And with regard to the ecosystem function, we can think about that in terms of the food webs and changes in productivity or biogeochemical processes, and also connectivity between different populations. And in the 3rd dimension, that allowed us to consider the developmental phase, so construction as well as pre-construction activities, the operational phase, and then the decommissioning phase. So we used this tool to try and pull together the different aspects that the ecosystem would be affected by. Using that 3-dimensional approach as a tool, we identified 35 research topics in full. And we would highlight that the 35 topics that we identified are very important. But using the survey mechanism, we managed to categorise them into 1st order, 2nd order, and 3rd order priorities. Next slide, please. So our key take-home message is that the consideration of benthic cumulative effects requires a broad consideration of topics. And so you can see here along in the table, across the top is the 1st dimension, so the different topics that we identified. And then in the left-hand side there, you can see the ecological themes that we worked towards. And I think if you can see the full screen, you can see that not all of the questions fitted into the table. There is an other category at the bottom as well. And so after identifying the 35 questions, we went back to this framework and we categorised them according to the topic. And the numbers that you're looking at is a count of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd order according to the topic. Obviously, that's quite subjective, and if we had that conversation with different benthic ecologists, then the categorisation might be slightly different. But this gives us a really good feel as to where the kind of important topics are. You can see that the artificial reef effect actually has the majority of the questions falling into that category. And part of that could well be due to the familiarity with the artificial reef effects, or perhaps the body of literature that has identified many of the questions and has led to like the next generation of questions to be raised as well. It's also a very broad topic which covers a variety of subjects from organic enrichment through to habitat provision and a number of others as well. In comparison, seafloor disturbance didn't get quite as much as much attention, which is possibly due to the fact that we feel some of the questions have been addressed through other marine activities, and we can draw synergies with those as well. Whereas although artificial reef effects are also present through other structures, the way that they're presented from offshore wind is quite different and on that scale. So some other considerations to take into effect there. With regard to energy emissions, so specifically heat and electromagnetic fields, it's possible that the kind of lower number of questions that arise is partly due to the lower level of familiarity and also the uncertainty associated with that topic. So noting that we are focused on cumulative effects, I think it's important that we resist the urge to focus on any one particular area and instead try to take a more combined approach. Remembering as well that individual effects which may seem unimportant we will become significant when they're acting together with others. That's also important to consider the potential amplification of effects. particularly which may become important as a broad-scale offshore wind development at the kind of large scale that's likely to occur with the upcoming proliferation. The benthic ecosystem is, of course, a complex system, and so will likely require a number of complex models. And the more complex the model is, the more it has to rely on robust and reliable data. So most likely we'll need to take an integrated approach going forward to explore these effects in labs and in the field, and as well to combine that with modelling. Next slide, please. So in terms of the first order priority topics that we identified, the first two that are listed there would fall into the other category. So one of those was like practical considerations. So for example, are we able to design an integrated survey for trawl surveys and stock assessments for inside and outside of wind farms, which allows for the comparison biases and limitations of different survey methods? Another consideration was what quality assurance and quality control could be applied as standard practice to new data collection. And that's also applicable to some of the other topics here today. Broad scale questions that came up, one which has already been touched on, is how do we disentangle the effects of offshore winds due to climate change, and indeed other shifting baselines as well. And also which species specifically should be considered when we're siting offshore wind farms, and the potential to examine the potential impacts. The majority of questions, though, fell into the effects of ecosystem structure and function, and examples of those include how natural and artificial substrates compare in their structural and functional ecology, but also why. In addition to that, what the influence of changes in recruitment and connectivity are, as well as settlement around offshore wind farm areas. Another one that was identified was how much organic enrichment and increased productivity occurs, and what is the spatial extent of those effects. And with regard to energy emissions, the electromagnetic fields and potential effects and predator-prey interactions, as well as the ability to derive locational cues, was identified as in that first priority order as well. But of course, this is a very small snapshot of questions that were identified, so do hope that you'll consider the full report when it becomes available. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Zoe. I think Stephen has answered one or two questions in writing as they have come in, but we do have one question left about whether the group was focusing more on floating or fixed platforms for discussions.
I think we mostly focused on fixed offshore wind, but floating did appear in it as well. So I wouldn't say that we excluded floating wind from it.
Yeah. Another question that I think Stephen answered in writing, but just so that everyone can hear, was asking about baseline monitoring and trying to understand sort of the current ecosystem and the importance of that, which definitely is reflected in the report, even if it's not reflected in some of the topics that we featured here. So as you said, I think that's, we're directing people towards the reports when they become available, for sure.
Okay, great, thank you.
We have another minute or so left. We have another question that came into the Q&A. How applicable do you think local studies on benthos will be to wind farms in general?
I think that we really need to understand the local effects on the benthos, because that's where they are most measurable, and it's most likely that we then have to think about how to scale that up to wind farm and also regional changes. In some contexts, the region and where those studies take place will be important and won't be directly transferable. But some of the effects and processes, they can certainly be like we can infer certain aspects of that. So I think we certainly need to focus on the local scale effects, but design those studies to inform on the regional scale effects, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. That was great.
Thanks.
All right, next up we have Art Popper from the University of Maryland and Environmental Bioacoustics LLC, who will be discussing outcomes from the group that was focused on fishes and aquatic invertebrates.
Okay, thank you, Kate, and hello, everybody. Can we have the first slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so we started out with thinking about, with the question being a lot broader than we originally where we wound up, in that we were looking at any sensory stimulation, whether it be light, light, chemical, and so forth. But it quickly became apparent that really the group's expertise lay in only one area, that was in sound and vibration, and we could identify nobody to bring in who are looking at other stimuli that may be associated with the offshore wind farms. I do think it's important to this stage to make sure that at some point down the line, we not ignore the fact that there are electromagnetic fields and chemicals and things that need to be taken into consideration. And I think some of the issues we addressed probably relate to some of those as well. So the premise we're looking at is sound and vibration, and sound being anything produced by anthropogenic, that's man-made sources or anything else. And we decided that the real issue is not that these things can harm the animals in terms of damage or kill them, but the real issue is that the sounds can interfere with the ability of the animals to do their daily normal things. Fishes and aquatic invertebrates, for many of them, use sound to learn about their environment, learn to communication, and just getting a general gestalt of what's around them. And so doing anything that impairs this ability to know what's going on around the animal is something that has potential effects. The issue is really basically that fishes and many aquatic invertebrates use sound to learn about the environment that's at a much greater distance than anything else, any other sensory stimulus they might use. One of the problems, though, is that for fishes and for aquatic invertebrates, there are tremendous gaps in what we know about anything with regard to sound and vibration. The level of knowledge is far smaller, particularly in terms of potential effects, than, for example, with marine mammals. I think Brandon Southall will be bringing that up later on. But the fact is, we decided that this is an area that a tremendous amount of information is needed. And the question is then, what are the most important questions that we want to examine? And then what are the ways we can deal with them? So go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, thanks. So a key take-home messages from our group is that the knowledge we have about sound and vibration need to be filled before we can really make significant recommendations in terms of how to deal with them, how to mitigate the sounds. And the kinds of questions that we need to ask and the gaps that we have not only affect current things that we do, but also long-term cumulative effects. The problem is for both fishes and marine mammals, in marine invertebrates, is there are lots of species, far too many for anyone to adequately study in toto. And it needs some kind of approach that selects the appropriate species for the questions being asked. That is, a lot of people doing fish hearing right now are using things like zebrafish or animals that don't, or goldfish, my own lab included, and those aren't the species of relevance. We need to look at the species and decide which species of fishes, which species of invertebrates are the ones we need to be doing the research upon. And there are many ways that one can select those species. Clearly, we need to focus on behavioral responses as opposed and hearing, as opposed to things like physical effects, because physical effects happen only very close to a source. In the case of wind farms, they're likely only to happen during construction, if there are any at all. And that isn't going to have the same kind of potential effect if from the behavioral impact. The kinds of studies needed are comprehensive. We need studies at offshore wind farm sites to look at the exact way animals respond to the stimuli. We need controlled field studies, and in some cases, lab studies are adequate. But one of the things that many of us in the group felt is the lab studies don't give you quite the same kind of information as you get from doing field or control or site studies of the offshore wind farms, primarily because the animals behave differently in the lab in an enclosed environment than they will in an offshore or offshore environment. Very, very important is that we need to be considering not just what all of us have been looking at over the past 50 years, which is sound pressure, but its fact of the matter is all fishes and probably all invertebrates that hear respond to particle motion. And this is quite different. It's part of sound, but it's a different part that doesn't occur in the air very much, or it's not very significant in air. But really, as opposed to sound pressure, particle motion needs to be considered. And as several people have pointed out, the other thing we need to start considering, which has been barely touched upon, is substrate vibration. Sound gets into the substrate, whether it be from the construction process or actually a functioning wind farm that has piles into the ground. And this sound comes out of the substrate. It'll affect animals that live very close to the bottom. It will travel considerable distances, but we have no data on that. So everything, any studies we do must take into consideration particle motion and substrate vibration, as well as sound pressure. Next slide, please. So we came up with about 7 different topics. We tried to put them in priority order, but we realized that they're all interactive. And when we ask one question, we're probably asking another. The key question to start with, though, is identifying the species to study. I alluded to this already in the last slide. Without knowing what species to study and picking species in a very expeditious manner. That is, pick a species that may represent other species. In 2014, a number of us worked on a project where we came up with criteria for effective sound on fishes and turtles, and we broke down fishes into different types of hearing groups because we couldn't do all 33,000 species, and the same thing has to be done here. We need to pick species that are relevant to offshore wind farm sites, but also represent more than just their own species. Very critically, we need to do behavioral studies that look at the way the fish are changing behavior, if they do change behavior, when they're living in an offshore wind farm site, both during construction and during the long-term aspects of having the site there. What do the fish do? How do they respond? Are we affecting their survival in any way, their reproductive capabilities? And third, we need to do a very complicated study to look at displacement of the animals, both fishes and invertebrates, from the areas that have the wind farms where there's noise and vibration. Without that kind of information, we really don't know if anyone's leaving. We also developed suggested other recommendations. We can talk about those later. But the critical issue is that there are such substantial gaps in our knowledge that we need to start filling these in before we really can say how a wind farm may or may not affect fishes and aquatic invertebrates. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Art. We have a question about the likelihood of wind farms becoming de facto protected areas or reserves for fishes that may no longer be easily accessible to fishermen, and how that might change ecosystems.
We did not consider that at all, because we're at the point where we have so little knowledge that it's just hard to make any broad substitutions. I think this is being looked at or being considered in Europe, but I'm not totally familiar with that. But it's a critical question to ask. But I don't think we're in a position to really have much to say at this point. Mm-hmm. It's more of a long-term question, I think.
And the situation with fishing does vary, I think, between countries too, in terms of accessibility within wind farms.
Yeah.
There's a question about bubble curtains for wind turbine construction and whether those might be, I think, effective for fishes.
Yeah, it hasn't been looked at particularly. The problem is with most of the mitigation methods that are available, they really work at sound levels, at frequencies rather, that are the high end of the hearing range of fishes and probably way above the hearing range of aquatic invertebrates. That is, there are no strong data to suggest that they actually work at the low frequencies that the animals that we're concerned with dealing with are using. The other part of it is for animals that live close to the bottom or on the bottom, the construction means vibration into the bottom, and none of the mitigation methods that are available, air bubble curtains, cofferdams, impact those sounds. So in fact, it's very possible that the mitigation methods that are being used today, whether they be bubble curtains or anything else, will have much of an effect to protect fishes and aquatic invertebrates. It's a very important area for research.
I think we've maybe got like 30 seconds left. So let's do one more question. It sounds, the person saying, it sounds as if this issue of sound is a more local one. So how do you think this could result in danger for a population?
Well, it may not be that local. It depends on how far the sound propagates from the source. There's some evidence that some of these sounds can travel quite great distances. And it's also a situation where we don't know how far substrate vibration travels, but it probably travels a lot further than the signals that are in the water. So it's not just necessarily the areas at the wind farm, but it may be larger areas. And if we come back to the early question, if the wind farms become an area where fishes start to populate and reproduce, and yet it's interfering with their ability to reproduce, we may wind up having population effects.
Great. Thank you so much, Art. That was fantastic.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we're going to move on now to sea turtles. And Greg Gitschlag recently retired, very recently, from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And Greg's going to be discussing the outcomes from the sea turtle group.
Thanks very much, Kate. One of the first things I just realized in listening to the previous speakers, some of them had very broad topic areas, all benthos creatures or all fish and invertebrates. Well, now we're looking at sea turtles, and as some of you probably know, in the U.S. Off U.S. coastal waters, there's only 5 species. So I guess we had an easier task than some of these other groups. Next slide, please. So in the Sea Turtle Working Group, we, as other previous speakers found, there's very little known about potential sea turtle interactions with offshore wind, though some information is available about sea turtle interactions with other industries, for example, offshore oil industry. Possible short-term effects of OSW development on sea turtles include displacement, behavioral disruption, stress, temporary hearing impairment, vessel interactions, and changes to prey availability. Long-term impacts may include changes in the distribution of sea turtles and their prey, changes in vessel traffic, and ecosystem enhancement. Now, the Sea Turtle Work Group identified 8 short-term priorities. We're going to get to those in just a moment. Next slide. But first, let's take a quick look at the key take-home messages. There are substantial spatial and temporal data gaps in our understanding of populations and distributions in wind energy areas, as well as potential effects to sea turtles posed by OSW development. Sea Turtle Work Group members prioritize research, or should I say we try to prioritize research, to fill these gaps in baseline data on sea turtle distribution, abundance, habitat use, and movements, with an emphasis on understanding environmental drivers. A focus is also needed in the immediate term on stressor-specific investigations of offshore wind effects to turtles, such as artificial reef effects, entanglement, vessel strikes, noise, or EMF. Next slide. There we go, thanks. Now we'll take a look at the key short-term research topics, and we did try to prioritize these. So right up at number 1 is develop a better understanding of sea turtle movements, distributions, and habitat use patterns, including changes in habitat use in relation to offshore wind development. But the goal here is to study sea turtle movements and habitat use in order to better understand potential risk of interactions with OSW facilities and inform models of abundance and vessel strike risk that require information on dive behavior and other metrics. Suggested methods from our group include deploying large numbers of satellite and acoustic transmitters and acoustic receivers to conduct individual tracking of sea turtles in the U.S. Atlantic, both pre and post construction of offshore wind facilities. Large numbers of rehabilitated cold stun turtles are collected each year and may be available for tagging, although wild-caught turtles should also be included in the study for obvious reasons. In addition, regional coordination may allow for partnering with ongoing turtle tagging studies in the area to realize significant cost savings. Priority number 2, collate existing tracking and survey data to update density and abundance estimates, characterize baseline habitat use patterns, and develop analytical approaches to integrated analysis. The goal here is to assess existing tracking and survey data across all species, it's all 4 or 5 species, for the offshore region of interest, identify environmental drivers of distribution and habitat use patterns, in addition to wind farms, and determine possible data compilation and analytical approaches for using these data collectively to inform decision-making. Suggested methods for research raised by our group include desk-based review of available data in existing databases, as well as in the published literature, including information pertaining to turtle tracking and distribution, oceanic variables such as temperature, salinity, oxygen, currents, etc., and habitat in the area, such as topographic relief and other structures in addition to wind turbines. Priority number 3, assess sea turtle use of offshore wind structures, such as turbine foundations and the artificial reefs that form on these structures. Now, the goal here is to assess OSW structures' potential to provide foraging and sheltering opportunities for sea turtles. Suggested methods include monitoring of sea turtles using both observer and video aerial surveys, cameras mounted above and below structures, and underwater surveys conducted by divers as well as ROVs. Also, monitoring prey around structures, sampling of prey species using such techniques as trawls, bottom grabs, environmental DNA, ROVs, drop cameras, etc. An investigation of consumed prey via direct sampling such as stomach lavage and dietary tracers. We also developed 5 additional research topics, and I'll just run through the names of those at the bottom of the page. For an in-depth coverage of those, I'll refer you to the draft report that's currently available online. So number 4 is to examine physiological and behavioral responses of sea turtles to offshore wind sound. Number 5, improve our understanding of sea turtle hearing and morphology. 6 focuses on an assessment of vessel strike risk posed to sea turtles by OSW activities. 7, assess the risk to sea turtles from offshore wind-related entanglement with fishing gear. And finally, 8, examine sea turtle behavioral responses to electromagnetic fields. I think we probably have a few minutes left over. Kate, if there's any questions. I'm checking the Q&A.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, we have a question about the applicability of past research on sea turtle use of oil rig structures in the Gulf of Mexico, which I know is something you're very familiar with.
Yeah, I have a good bit of experience with sea turtles and oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. For over 30 years, we've been conducting surveys, visual surveys, aerial and surface. This is not video, just human observers, to essentially protect these turtles and also marine mammals from underwater explosives used to remove old oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. So we've got a lot of information on that. However, additional studies have been done, tracking studies in the Gulf of Mexico, delineating home areas as well as long-term migration. And some of these include oil field. So there is some information there on that. There have been other detailed investigations, biological assessments of platforms, new platform fields that have gone in, and there's extensive literature on that as well. Very little has been done with sound out in the field. So does that kind of address that question? Any follow-up questions relating to that?
What about, I mean, there were questions that came up with a group around artificial reef effects and sea turtles actually using areas around platforms. Is that something that you see in the Gulf of Mexico?
Yes, it is. As a matter of fact, when tagging studies began, I'm talking about satellite tagging and sonic tagging of turtles began back in the 90s. Our laboratory down in Galveston with the Fishery Service was one of the early players there. And we would actually source our turtles, a lot of our turtles, by going offshore, conducting dives beneath the platforms during the daytime and nighttime, and then capturing them. We found that some turtles will actually sleep underneath the oil platforms at night. What they'll do is they'll encounter scoured areas around the base of the legs or under what's called mud mats. It's a structure right there at where the platform meets the sea floor. And we can catch them either resting or actually sleeping on the sea bottom in some cases.
Cool. All right. Well, it's actually time to move on. We are going to take a few quick minutes for a break here, actually. Brandon is up next to talk about marine mammals, but let's take just like a 3-minute break and be back here at 2 minutes of the hour and give everyone a chance to go grab a cup of coffee or whatever. So meet back here in 3 minutes. And thanks so much, Greg. All right, I think Brandon, if you are back, I think we can probably go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, absolutely. All right.
Okay.
So next up, we have Brandon Southall of Southall Environmental Associates, who will be discussing the outcomes of the Marine Mammal Work Group.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And just a acknowledgement to Laura Morse, who worked very closely with me on this. And just a lot of thanks to Kate and everybody at BRI that were really helpful in this. And this was the largest of the working groups. We had a lot of people with a lot of diverse experience and great insight and opinions, which was great. It just, we had to meet 3 times and we had a lot of ideas. So just thank you to everybody for giving those and helping us try to work them into something that is useful and somewhat coherent. So I'll tell you where we got to. Go ahead to the next one, please. As you know, as in many of these areas, there is a lot that we don't know. I think it's important to emphasize that there is a lot that we do know. There's some species that we have a lot of information, and we're at the point of being able to do things like population models and look at cumulative effects and multiple stressors. That's something that's ongoing for important species like right whales that are obviously a very important focus for these issues with offshore wind. There are gaps that we have about just the distribution of some species that may interact with some of these devices. There's also, it's kind of notable that some of the specific kind of interactions and responses of baleen whales with offshore wind is a kind of a big question. As most people here know, a lot of the work that's been done, the extensive work that's been done in Europe has really considered other species like harbor porpoise. We have a lot that we know from that about things like behavioral responses that is an important baseline to sort of go from. But the interactions of baleen whales in particular and how they may react to the installation and or operation of these devices is kind of a big unknown. So that's a sort of a high level observation. We always have this issue with any kind of noise and marine mammals and whales in particular, that we don't have the same kind of information about sensory capabilities in baleen whales, and we have to use sort of indirect measures in relation to what we know about other species. So those are some gaps that we have, but I think it's important to realize there is a lot that we know about some parts of this, and we're trying to build on some of that and incorporate some things. So we looked at several different kind of existing approaches that have been taken to address these kind of issues about marine mammal responses to noise from other kinds of sound sources. The Navy put together and has been operating for over a decade, a monitoring program. And the framework that we came up with, this occurrence, conditions, and stimuli response consequences framework, was based on that, with some other information from projects looking at seismic surveys in Alaska and new ideas about hydrokinetics and frameworks to look at that. So we modified this cumulative impacts framework to pull some information from some successful and existing programs. Conditions and stimuli sort of used to be exposure, because we're really just looking at noise exposure, but you see there things like vessel strike risk that's come up, things like ecosystem kind of issues related to changes in the prey base, things that may interact with other bigger picture ongoing things that aren't related to development necessarily. But this was our sort of framework, looking at what's out there, occurrence, just where are things, what is their density, what is their kind of baseline state. Then conditions and stimuli, as I mentioned, kind of goes beyond just noise. That's where my expertise is, but a lot of these issues and a lot of the expertise we had considered some of these other important aspects of kind of what the exposure is, and the contextual aspects of exposure. And then response, how animals may interact with and respond to a stressor that could include their behavioral change. And that's an important one. I would say the same thing that Art had said in terms of noise. In marine mammals, we have enough information to say it's probably unlikely that there will be these kind of like high order injurious or physical injury effects from noise in almost all circumstances, maybe not all circumstances, but most of the issues we're considering there are behavioral kind of issues and or physiological kind of issues. So those kind of came in to the consideration as well, but how those behavioral issues are manifest in habitat use and how sublethal effects may influence energetics and life history or kind of fitness parameters, both at the individual and group level. And then finally, what do these things mean? How do these things, how are they manifest in fitness, and what do those things mean at the population level, which is really kind of the cumulative impacts, key question. So we came up with quite a lot, almost 20 topics in those areas. You see just the what's out there came up pretty high, the highest up that list. The response questions also pretty high. I think they're all equally important. It's just sort of a continuum of studies. But from those, we came up with our sort of highest priorities, and then had to and tried to not have them all be high priority. They're all actually pretty important questions, but we did go through this prioritization, and I'll talk a little more detailed about the highest three. Okay, next please. Yeah, so just kind of our overall messages. I mentioned this gap with baleen whales, and given the location of where some of these are, and the strong seasonal presence, and the endangered status, critically endangered in the form of right whales, but endangered in other baleen whales, and the lack of data, that really is a priority that we thought was important. We thought that using kind of methods based on potential risk, population status, spatial temporal interaction, and potential vulnerability to offshore wind stressors was an important way to go about kind of identifying high priority species. Obviously, the right whale comes to the top of that list for reasons that I think everybody here probably knows. And the focus on mitigating these kind of near-term impacts are the key, top priority. But there was there's some issues related to how we model impacts and look at these kind of ecosystem levels to recognize that a behavioral change in one context may not mean the same thing as it does in another context, and how those are integrated, incorporated, and fit into these population models is challenging, but it's doable, and there's a lot of effort ongoing, and momentum and capability to be able to do some of those kind of things. And while we recognize the importance of keeping the focus on offshore wind and the effects of offshore wind, it's just important to realize that these animals are operating in environments that are in some instances that are highly ephemeral naturally, and are changing in various ways, due to bigger picture kind of issues like climate change, like other stressors. So it's important that we get information, and there are people collecting a lot of this kind of information using passive acoustics, using environmental sampling, using remote sensing methods, using tracking and telemetry to get at data before construction happens, in order to kind of inform some of these models. So that's a lot in a short time of our take-home messages, but go ahead to the next one. Here, this was our top three, and you see the other sort of next tier down, and realize there's 12 below that. You'll be able to see all of them in the report. I think this was hard for all of us to do, as with the other groups, I'm sure. But there's, I'll just mention the top three. They're important to mention too. We split these out within kind of the taxa: baleen whales, odontocetes, and pinnipeds, and kind of identified which ones of these we have key questions on. So the top three that we came up with related to the presence, distribution, and environmental factors driving some of those things for certain key species. Again, there's been a lot of focus on some species like right whales. There's been almost no real effort on some of these other species like gray seals or common dolphins in some of these areas. They've been involved in some of the stock assessment reports, but looking at some of these things, and particularly looking at them on some finer scales, is the kind of thing that goes into the first one there. The second one really is in that response category, looking at what are the exposure and particularly the contextual conditions. The literature on marine mammal behavioral responses is really, focused on these observations that what the animals are doing at the time is important to their response. So acute responses and the kind of covariates that go along with that to be able to inform these risk assessment approaches of consequences important there. And I think for baleen whales, again, that's particularly important. And then the third one was we just lack some data on baseline movement and behavior for some of these to inform things like individual movement models and long-term habitat utilization. So there's some baseline data that we have, again, some species better than others. And I think I'll leave the other ones in the interest of time. And again, there's 12 more, but I think maybe I'll stop there, and you can tell me, Kate, if there are questions to get to.
There are a few questions in the Q&A. I think in the interest of time, we might move on to the next group. But Brandon, if you click on that Q&A button, you can see the questions and you can actually type in answers. So if you're willing to take a look at those and maybe respond to them in writing when we move on to the next group, that would be great.
Will do.
All right, thank you. All right, so next up we have Chris Hine from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, who will be talking about the outcomes of the BAT work group. Chris?
Thanks, Kate. And like other presenters, I really appreciate all the working group participants who contributed to this, this effort, and of course to Kate and BRI and NYSERDA for putting this on. Next slide, please. So with respect to bats, the primary concern is with collision mortality. And we have this concern based on what we know of how bats interact with wind turbines at land-based wind energy facilities. Fatality rates can be rather high, particularly for certain species of migratory tree roosting bats. There's also growing evidence that some of these species are attracted to wind turbines and spend a lot of time flying in and out of the rotor swept area, investigating blades, the nacelle, the tower. So that increases their risk. What we don't know is a lot about how bats use the offshore space. Recent studies have provided insight that pretty much wherever you put detectors, you will get some bat activity, but activity levels tend to be lower than what we see on land in similar studies. This might be because there are fewer bats offshore. It also might be that bats just aren't echolocating as they offshore as they might on land. The patterns of activity offshore mirror those from what we see on onshore studies, in that activity levels increase during late summer and early fall under low wind speed conditions and warmer temperatures. So throughout this effort, the work group identified 8 priorities. Next slide, please. These priorities in general can be grouped into 3 categories or research gaps. One is just on information related to bats and bat use offshore. How many bats are offshore? How do they use the space? For example, is there a gradient of activity drop off with distance to shore? The second area has to do with how we monitor activity and fatality offshore. With respect to quantifying mortality, we can't use the same type of data collection that we can at terrestrial wind farms. And so we need a suite of technologies, thermal cameras, acoustic detectors, strike indicators, perhaps telemetry and radar. and how we use these offshore and integrate them into the offshore wind infrastructure is important. And then the third area has to do with if there is a risk, what do we do about it? How do we mitigate collision mortality? And how do we apply the strategies that are currently being used or tested onshore? How do we modify those for the offshore environment? So the take-home messages are that we don't know a lot. We kind of anticipate that there will be a risk based on what we know from land-based wind energy studies, but we need to quantify this, and we can do that by measuring activity and mortality. And it's that second one that's really going to help answer the question of whether wind turbines present a collision risk for bats. But we need the technology advancement and validation in order to do that. We also identified some non-research priorities that need to occur sooner rather than later, so that when the technology is available and wind deployment is there, we know what we're doing. So data standardization, identifying the biases or assumptions of using these technologies, what constitutes high or low risk, what is a suitable sample size for monitoring in the offshore environment. Those are things that we need to figure out and develop protocols for. And we also need data transparency so that everybody has access to these data and can build off of it, learn from it, and make informed decisions. Next slide, please. So with respect to research, two main topic areas are collecting data, acoustic data or activity data during the operational phase of the project. Here we can really assess exposure. When are bats present around wind turbines? What are the weather conditions? What are the operational conditions in which bats are at risk? And the other, as I mentioned, is actually quantifying mortality and determining whether that is a concern or not. But I'd say equal to the research areas are these non-research priorities. I already discussed the first two, but we identified two others. One is, because we're going to be using technology, how do we incorporate it with the infrastructure in a safe and compatible manner? These technologies will need to be installed somewhere. They will need power. Maybe that comes from the turbine, maybe it comes from solar panels, and they'll need communication. We can't go and visit and download data and check on the status of the equipment regularly as we might onshore. So how do we receive data? How do we check on the status of the technology will be important. And then the fourth one here is discussing our mitigation approaches. We don't want to be in a situation where we identify that there is a risk and then have a lag time before we can do anything about it. So it's really important to think about what mitigation options we have, how they might be modified from what we know based on land-based studies, and so that we're prepared. We had a couple of other topics that are listed here that include baseline studies that will just help us understand how bats are using the offshore environment and the patterns of movement, and what, if any, is the relationship between distance to shoreline, because it could turn out that at a certain distance bat activity drops off dramatically and may not be an issue for facilities that are sited at that distance. So with that, I'll stop and I'll open up a Q&A here and see what questions we might have.
Yeah, we have a question about how far offshore bats are likely to be found.
So they're are anecdotal reports from a long time ago that they're found, hundreds of kilometers offshore. Recent efforts using acoustic detectors and aerial surveys have documented sightings, observations, 150, 160 kilometers offshore, but a lot of activity has been reported. If you look at like the average, it's in the 40 to 60 kilometer range from the shoreline. So they move offshore, probably more so than or at greater distances than a lot of people think.
And I think let's take time for one more question. Do you need an assessment of the population that may be exposed? So how much data is available on the estimated population size for bat species that may be at risk, to sort of put the potential offshore wind impacts in context?
Yeah, it's an important question, and we know very little about bat populations onshore, let alone offshore. We did discuss this, and of course, to assess cumulative effects, you need some sense of the population. There are strategies, monitoring strategies that can help us understand trends, population trends for bats, such as the North American Bat Monitoring Program that could be applied offshore as well. And we might be able to relate, the trends offshore with those onshore. So it's very important in order to really assess the potential population level impact of any stressor on bats.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. We do have a few more questions in the Q&A if you're able to take a look at those after this. But I think let's move on to our next and our last work group. Angus Cook is from the British Trust for Ornithology, and he'll be discussing the outcomes of the bird work group.
Thanks, everyone. And yeah, just thanks to BRA for asking me to do this, and to everyone else that contributed to the birds working group. Go on to the next slide, please. So yeah, I think we know quite a lot about what the potential impacts are due to a lot of the work that's been going on in Europe at the minute. And we know we're starting to build up a much better understanding of things like avoidance and displacement and collision risk and things like that. And I think that really helped sort of shape some of the questions we were asking and thinking about maybe how we build on what's been done in Europe rather than necessarily trying to repeat it. I think one of the things is, I mean, we're saying here that cumulative effects for US are largely unknown, but actually I think that's probably a reasonable, it's reasonable to say that we're still struggling with that issue in Europe as well. So it's not just a problem in the US, it's a problem much more widely, and how we deal with that sort of something we need to think a bit more about. But overall, we spent quite a lot of time talking about what types of projects might be needed, and we starting to think about how we could categorize those and how they and they all sort of started. I think some common themes started emerging, and we started seeing things that maybe sort of nicely flowed from one another. So we started off, we identified some things that maybe we want to start with, and just get everything in place to make sure that the data are there as the assessments go forward. Then we started thinking about needing to understand where birds are and why they're there, and then starting to think, scaling up to things like what are the individual impacts with a focus on collision, but actually I think displacement flows through quite a lot of the topics as well, and then ultimately what does it mean for the populations as a whole. And there were a few other questions that came up that didn't quite fit into any of those categories. So next slide, please, Kate. So yeah, I think we came up with a sort of fairly long list, and it was a mixture of things that could be done in the short term and stuff that was a much longer term effort. And we think that there's a sort of need to sort of consider a mix of these, and it's not that one set of projects is more important than another. It's the fact it's sort of understanding exactly what the evidence base is as the industry develops, and then making sure that the monitoring and infrastructure is put in place now, so that as the industry develops, we've got the data to properly assess the impacts going forward. I think as a sort of first step, we identified that there's need to get a really good handle on what the species that we're most concerned about. So there was discussions about things like the movement of auks and gannets during the winter, and where they are, and how they might be exposed to wind farms. There was discussion about migratory species. So there's lots of terns, there's lots of shorebirds potentially moving through these areas. Which of these species are we most concerned about, and how do we come up with some sort of prioritization of this, and how does this vary between areas? So we might have some areas where we're much more concerned about one set of species than another. We need to start thinking about things like habitat and prey drivers. So why are the birds out there? What are they doing in these areas? And then that really starts linking back to things like displacement. So if we've got lots of birds in an area, what are the consequences going to be if the birds then get displaced from these areas? Where are they going to go? What sort of alternative habitat might be there, and at what sort of scale might they be displaced? Again, following on from that, collision risk is the one that I think most people start immediately leap to when they're talking about wind farms. And we know from Europe that collisions do occur, but there's still quite a lot of uncertainty about what sort of scale collisions might occur at. So we need to start thinking about how can we start coming up with more reliable estimates of collision risk. How can we start really refining some of the parameters that underpin our assessment of collision risk pre and post construction? And then we need to start thinking about, okay, well, we know these effects are happening, but ultimately, what do they mean for the population? So what if we're seeing one or two birds that might get displaced from the foraging area or something like that? Does it have an effect at the population level? And I think this is the sort of crux of the cumulative issue. It's why are we interested? Why are we worried? What's going to happen to these populations as a consequence of the wind farms being in place? Next slide, please. So yeah, we came up with a sort of list of sort of key short-term research topics, and the first of these was this idea of coming up with some sort of exposure and vulnerability matrix. So can we identify the sort of key species that we're most concerned about in the different lease areas? Are there any sort of common themes here? Are we sort of consistently picking up species in these areas that are vulnerable to displacement, or species that are vulnerable to collision? How do we use that to then target further research? Again, we need to start thinking about populations. What's going to be the consequences of these impacts at the population level? What data do we have to underpin any population models, and how sensitive are these models to our assumptions about things like demographic rates? How can we sort of use this information to then start thinking, okay, we need more effort in this particular area here, or on these particular parameters, if we're going to be able to get a really good handle on what the cumulative effects of offshore wind at a population level might be. Again, it's understanding where the birds are and why they're there. What's driving these patterns of these distributions? What's going to happen if suddenly they lose a sort of species, might lose a sort of core foraging area, what's that going to mean to the population? Do we have, is there sufficient alternative habitat available, or are we going to see something like we've seen in Europe with the red-throated divers, where we see these sort of fairly broad distributions and then suddenly concentrated in a single area? What are the consequences of that going to be, and how severe might displacement be at a population level? We need to start thinking about sort of seabird behaviours, particularly flight heights, and thinking about how these might vary in relation to environmental conditions, and to try and really get a much better handle on things like collision risk and what's driving it and how it might vary. But at the same time, we sort of came up with some additional sort of background topics that need just some things that need to be put in place at the minute so that we've got these sort of sources going forward as the industry develops. So things like, can we come up with ways of making sure that all the data is sort of stored in a standardized, centralized place? Can we sort of get a handle on exactly what's available at present? And I think getting this sort of stuff in place now is going to make assessing cumulative impacts as the industry develops much easier in the future. So that's where we've got to. And if there's any questions, then yeah, happy to take them just now.
Great, thank you so much, Angus. I'm not seeing any questions, and we actually are due to start the panel discussion anyway. So if you could keep an eye on the Q&A and answer any, oh, there's questions coming in now. If you could take a look at the Q&A when you have a minute, that would be great. But I think let's move on to the panel discussion. So if all of our panelists could turn your video on when you have a minute. So that was great. That was very, very brief reviews from everyone on some of the key outcomes from the work groups. We will email all of you when these reports are finalized in June. And in the meantime, as a reminder, most of them are available for viewing on the eTwig website, and the link is on the screen now. And in addition to those individual work group reports, NYSERDA is going to release the workshop proceedings later this year that will summarize both the November event as well as the outcomes of these work groups. And so we'll be trying to sort of synthesize the outcomes of the 7 work groups in that proceedings. And several of you have pointed out in the Q&A already that there are a lot of sort of linkages and interrelationships between the topics that have been discussed by the groups and topics that have just come up repeatedly. And so we wanted to have at least a brief discussion among some of the work group leads about where some of those linkages are. So we have a few questions that we have identified for the panelists that we're going to ask them. Let me stop screen sharing here so we can see everybody. So let's start with Stephen, since he hasn't had a chance to talk yet today. Stephen, where do you see some interrelationships or connections between your work group, the Benthos work group, and the topics covered by some of the other work groups?
Yeah, I think that quite a lot of, but there are quite a lot of possibilities for interrelations, and of course, as Zuli also introduced the benthos, the benthos is not just a couple of taxa, it's like half of the ecosystem if you look at. So it's a very basis of quite a lot of processes that are happening in our oceans. So from that perspective, there's quite a lot of connections to much of the work that has been presented here. And I think you can look at it from 2 sides. On the one hand side, it's about aspects like the artificial reef effect that has been mentioned by many people, the artificial reef effect that may impact production of species, and particularly if you think about the food resources that may be offered by the benthos. So there's direct link there. There's also a very direct link with the reproduction and connectivity. And then I'm thinking about the hydrodynamics group. I do know that the hydrodynamics group has much focused on change in stratification, but there are these other topics that also have been presented on the very first slide. by Jeff, I guess. There's quite a lot of, if you think about reproduction, connectivity, if you think about dispersal of larvae, settlement of organisms, there definitely is a link there. And then if it comes to the interaction of energy, or the introduction of energy, my apologies. If you think about sound and vibrations, Art already mentioned it, they have focused on the effects on fish, but there's also the effects on, of course, invertebrates. Much of those impacts clearly are going to interact with the artificial reef effect as we have been investigating it for the benthos. So there's quite a lot of possibilities to interact. And maybe one more thing I would like to add to that is, if you think about collaboration, I think all of the groups have mentioned the need for standardization of efforts, and standardization, quality assurance, quality. And I think that if you start thinking about where the interactions between the different taxon-specific working groups, or the issues that has been dealt with by the taxon-specific working groups, if you look at those interactions, then there definitely is quite a lot of possibilities to think about how we could actually have those standardizations not dealt with on a taxon specific basis, but dealt with, through overarching all the different groups. This is an exercise we have also done in Belgium, and it helps a lot to think about, okay, what are the questions, where are the links between the different taxa, and how can we organize our monitoring program so that we can start, trying to make connections between the observations for birds and the observation for benthos. How can we organize our monitoring programs in space and time? So I think that there's quite a lot of things that we could think about and we could optimize in the future as well. Thank you.
Great. Does anyone, Stephen covered a lot there, but does anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the level of interaction is tremendous. The only place I cannot see, because that's only because bats I don't think get in the water at all. Maybe they do, but the level of interaction in terms of understanding the environment, the signals in the environment, immediately permeates all of us, including the birds, in the sense that there are a lot of diving birds, and there are a number of questions circulating now in the U.S. and abroad. Is how do the sounds affect them? What do they hear underwater, and how do they respond to the sounds they hear underwater? But questions Brandon brought up, the question of turtles, these are all so intertwined that I think at some point it'll be very useful for all of us to be talking together as opposed to separately, and seeing where we interdigitate. And maybe there's some questions we could ask. They'll provide answers to all of us and suit our own needs.
I think there's from a bird perspective, there's obviously really interesting and important questions to be asked in relation to benthos and fish, because that's what the birds are eating. But I also think there's some really interesting questions around what's going to happen with environmental stratification and some of the changes to the sort of way air and water moves in and around the wind farm. And I think that's going to become more and more important, and there'll be some really interesting questions around that in the next few years.
Were you talking about changes in currents, ocean currents and things like this?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, maybe I can ask you then, because I don't know very much about birds. Like, what sort of scales would be of interest in that case? Would the really sort of fine scale wakes behind the structures be of interest, or?
Potentially, I mean, it's things like the sediment increased turbidity and stuff that's caused by the increased currents and that sort of thing, and also the sort of ability of birds to forage in those wakes potentially. I think there's some really interesting questions that could be asked around that.
All right, does anyone else want to weigh in, or should we move on to the next question?
I was interested in the artificial reef effect, and I was wondering what sort of impacts it might have on the hydrodynamics. I can see that if there's significant growth on the structures themselves, it could really impact the hydrodynamics, which it could be an important change actually. And I have no good feeling for how much that is actually.
Yeah. Well, the way we look, well, we have been investigating the impacts of the artificial reef on the hydrodynamics has been more from a physical perspective, like the structures being in the water and the erosion, the scar protection layer that is surrounding these structures, but not that much from what actually the benthos would add to that change. But we are particularly interested in finding out how the changes in the turbulences because of these physical, well, the changes in the turbulence because of the presence of this physical structure, how that impacts the distribution of organisms, particularly with regards to settlement. One or other way these species are, well, have to find their place. You know, these turbulences, they can stretch for several hundreds of meters. They can actually stretch throughout an entire offshore wind farm. How is that going to impact, for example, settlement of the sandy sediment type of fauna that is naturally prevailing in those areas? So there's quite a lot of questions about the interaction with hydrodynamics. Also linked, for example, to the sediment plumes that are caused by these offshore wind farms. What does that mean? What exactly are they? How far do they distribute them, and so on? That's where I think quite some interesting interactions could be investigated.
Yeah.
Great. I think let's move on to our next question. Greg, I'm going to put you on the spot, I think. If you were going to collaborate with another work group to try to fill the research gaps that were identified for the sea turtle group, what other group would you pick to collaborate with and why?
Well, I think you asked the easiest question you could for me, I'll tell you. After hearing the marine mammal presentation and looking over one more time, there's so many similarities in the topics, and they're kind of just phrased slightly differently, but the top 2 or 3 research priorities listed in marine mammals pretty much nearly mirror ours. We're looking at sea turtle distribution. They're looking at marine mammal distribution. They're probably, we're anticipating our group proposes to use lots of tags in order to accomplish this sort of thing. And I see Brandon's kind of nodding his head there too. So then, you know, it's the habitat use, foraging, diving behavior. There's probably a lot of crossover opportunities here too between the 2 groups. You know, obviously whales are different than sea turtles. You're going to have different kinds of tags, but I mean, as far as perhaps sizes and actual models, but they're doing the same sort of thing. Also, if they aren't interested in using any sonic types of tags, certainly the sea turtles would that'd be great for them. We could partner up with the hearing arrays, the sonic sensor arrays, perhaps, if we coordinate the frequency of the transmitters that we put on the animals. So there's a whole diversity of overlap there. So that would be the key thing. What do you think, Brandon? Kick it over to you.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, driven by many of the same factors. I think the overlap in these, you know, megafauna, and then how those things relate to oceanographic and biological, you know, drivers of why they are where they are. You know, there's definitely a lot of synergies between the thinking that you guys had and what we have. I think I would agree. Yeah, and the longer term tag kind of approach is clearly something that's, you know, that's part of what some people are doing. It's part of some of the things that I think are you know, applicable. The transmitting tags, you get into some ranges with some of these animals where they can hear them, so we have to be a little bit careful with some of those, you know, so you don't have animals carrying around a smoke detector with a low battery beeping every 9 seconds in their pocket, you know, kind of part of it. But yeah, strategic deployments of some of those things is pretty useful.
That's one of the big differences, of course, between the sea turtles and marine mammals. Is marine mammals are so keyed into sounds, and there hasn't been much done on sea turtles because it's not a real big issue. Yeah, exactly.
Chris, I think Art mentioned that bats might be a little bit less interconnected than some of these other groups, but I think there are still a lot of similarities in that bats are obviously responding to the environment, and that's influencing their behaviors. Where are you seeing some sort of similarities and interrelationships with other groups?
Yeah, I think the obvious one is with birds, above surface methodologies, technologies used to monitor bats or birds are similar. And so, if you set up a system of receiving stations for telemetry that you can tag birds and bats and take advantage of that technology, radar, acoustics, cameras, I think would play well for answering questions for birds and bats. I'd really have to think and stretch ideas for interconnection with benthos and some of the other groups.
So I think this has come up in a couple of the presentations, but it seems like there are some challenges to implementing research priorities that you all have identified, and sometimes there are some commonalities across groups. So I think it would be helpful to talk a little bit about what some of those challenges are and how to address them. Jeff, do you want to take a first shot at that and think about sort of what some of the challenges are to implementing the research priorities that were identified in your group?
Yeah, I mean, we have specific ones in our group that maybe others don't have so much, like untangling sort of offshore wind farm changes with natural variability. But I guess there's other ones, like a lot of people identified as sort of, like having a kind of common platform where people can come together and put data in one spot. And it's not so much a research priority, but it's something that would definitely advance the observational side and then sort of enhance the science. So that seemed to be something that I heard in at least a couple presentations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does anyone else want to weigh in? Oh, Greg, I think you're muted.
Right. I think one of the commonalities and challenges between all the groups is that initially everyone is going to have to compile existing data, and there's a lot of different types of data that needs to be compiled. But one is it all relates to environmental for just about everything. Now, I guess the bats and the birds are different because you're kind of up in the atmosphere, but everybody else is in and under the water. So I would think that it would behoove when if and when all these research projects get out there and whichever ones get funded, I think it would behoove the actual investigators to kind of pool their resources and develop a common plan. Otherwise, they're going to be everybody's going to be reinventing the wheel independently and waste a lot of time and assets, I think.
And Stephen, that's something I think that you brought up in relation to some early projects at European offshore facilities where there was a lot of sort of individual research projects that weren't integrated and that it sort of caused some inefficiencies.
Well, inefficiencies, since most of these offshore wind farm monitoring programs are very much, dedicated to the assessment of the effects of a particular wind farm, the efficiency was high enough because they did what they had to do. The issue was that we could do much more if all of that would have been integrated to some extent. Yeah. And this is something that plays at many different levels. This is about designing the research, the selection of focus species. Art has been talking about what focus species you want to talk about, if it is about fish receptors for the impacts of underwater sound. What species, if we deal with different species and different locations, okay, well, we're not going to raise, the level of knowledge to something that could have been done if all of that would have been discussed properly beforehand. And there's also the issue, of course, of the openness or the accessibility of data. All depends on how data are collected, who is collecting data, and how these data access policies are. And then, of course, it's quite important to be as to think ahead about what are you going to do, how could this be organized across wider areas, and how can we make sure that we collect data in the very same manner, focusing on this very same response variables and making those data accessible to all. And that really helps a lot. So it's not that the monitoring programs are not efficient, but we could have done much better. That's for sure. Yeah.
Kate,
Mm-hmm.
I have one thing to add. I think maybe this kind of is a different way of saying some of the things that Stephen was just getting at. But one of the big challenges, and especially here where we have highly migratory species, some of which are also vulnerable, is just this issue of scale, spatial scale, right? Where you've got these questions that, that relate to habitat utilization for species that are moving thousands of miles. And then you have more acute questions about exposure and response that are occurring over kilometers. So the spatial scaling of it really calls for a multi-scale kind of approach to it, where you have to answer big questions, but you also care about these fine scale questions for something that's fixed in space.
Can I get two things? I think what Brandon said is very interesting, because he's talking about large scale and fine scale, but not really very fine scale. If you think about some of the invertebrates we're talking about, or something like a goby, their whole lifetime takes place in a couple of meters. And so we're talking about a scale that's, we're talking about going from what some of his whales do to what some of my gobies do. And it's a different order of magnitude, but the issues are really there. But I want to come back to something Steve said there. I think he said something very interesting. And I think what you're doing here, Kate, you and your colleagues with this meeting is very valuable in this sense. One of the things that we've discovered and over the years in considering just sound is that people don't talk to each other enough. That is, what we've discovered is that the marine mammal people talk to marine mammal people, fish people talk to fish people, the wind farm people talk to wind farm people, the oil people talk to oil people. And yet we have tons of things, we have lots of things in common. And one of the things you've done here is bringing us together in this conversation. And I think that one of the things that has to happen before any of this work goes forward is bringing people together from different perspectives, using different animals who are looking at different questions, to do exactly what you're doing here with the questions you're asking now. Because there are lots of synergies none of us have thought about, or we quickly realize if we were together in the same room and say, wow, that Steve said something really interesting, but I can contribute to that. Or the turtle people, I can contribute to the turtles, and somebody else can contribute to me. So I think getting people together from diverse interests is a really important thing to keep doing.
And getting thumbs up. Excellent. Angus, so we're focused here on trying to get a better handle on cumulative impacts, but as you noted, we're not necessarily there for a lot of species yet, where we're trying to fill some basic data gaps. Do you think we're going to be able to get there to start being able to estimate cumulative impacts from offshore wind with the data that we can acquire in the next 5 years? And if not, I'm anticipating your answer here. If not, then how is the consideration of cumulative impacts still a useful sort of framework for thinking about research priorities?
So, I think, cumulative impacts is a sort of key to this. We need to sort of understand what's happening to the populations. How's it all going to change? I think, from a bird's perspective, I think for some species we might be able to get there. So there's some species where I think you've got some really good data. So you've got sort of consistent monitoring data at colony level, where you've got really good GPS tracking data, and I think you can start you can start sort of using that to build up a big picture of, okay, where are the birds going to be exposed to the wind farms? How vulnerable are they likely to be? What are the sort of overall cumulative impacts likely to be? And I think that can then help you to sort of think about some of the other species where there's less data. You can start saying, okay, well, some of these species are clearly going to have, there's clearly going to be a big impact. How similar are some of these other species? What sort of impacts might we see here? How different do we believe these species might be in how they respond to offshore wind farms and things like that? And also by getting a really good handle on how the species where we've got really, really good data for, we can sort of get a better understanding of which of the parameters for these other species where we've not got such good data, which of these parameters are really key, and how should we be focusing efforts in that sense.
And Chris, what do you think about with bats? How useful is the sort of cumulative impacts framework for thinking about offshore wind impacts on bats, given how little we know about them offshore right now?
Yeah, the question was asked earlier, and we talked about it in the group. I mean, it's a really important question, but it's just going to take a long time. And we may never get to an understanding or a relatively precise population estimate. And I mean, this applies to a lot of other wildlife, but I think we can start to look at least trends in populations to see if they're stable, if they are increasing, decreasing, and start to relate that to changes in the environment, changes in deployment, and other factors. But it is a long-term effort. It's a challenging effort, particularly in the offshore environment. But if we want to see how really any stressor is impacting a population, you have to have that. You can't just have the impact data. You have to have some sense of what the population is doing.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on this? Stephen?
Yeah, maybe very briefly, if you talk about, okay, how long will it take before we can answer that question? I think we always have to keep in mind the question like, what's the uncertainty we are willing to accept? That goes with that, because we, of course, we will never get a 100% certainty about whatever we observe, and particularly about how applicable that will be in the future. So predictions will always go with an uncertainty, and this is about prediction. This is about what the impact will be, so we can do something about it. But I think that whatever we're talking about, we always have to keep in mind. It's a difficult discussion, I know, because of course this then links to the application of precautionary principles. But I think one or other way we have to keep that in the back, at least not in the back of our head, but we have to keep that on the table. What is the uncertainty we are willing to accept? And all of that will determine how much we will have to investigate, how much we'll have to invest in further data collection. And there's too many things to investigate, unfortunately.
Yeah, we developed some pretty long lists of priorities.
Yeah, I said unfortunately or fortunately, depends on how you look at it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a few minutes left. I think for our last question, I would be interested in hearing from each of you, if you had millions of dollars to fund a research project tomorrow, what on environmental effects of offshore wind, what project or study would you choose to fund immediately, and why? Art, do you want to start?
You had to look at me, huh? That's a great question. I think from the perspective of what I've been dealing with, and I think it has an impact on some of the other groups also. I think just figuring out ways to monitor the behavior and understand the behavioral responses to offshore wind in my animals, which are much harder to monitor than others because we can't put big transmitters on them. We can't do very much. We don't see them at the surface ever. But I think that is the fundamental question for us: is how do they respond behaviorally to the presence of the wind farms, to the sounds from the wind farms? And it's a big, expensive project and very, very hard. But I think that would be the place I would go.
Brandon?
Yeah, similarly, I think focusing on behavior, I think this multi-scale kind of and multi-trophic level focus would it be really important. It is an expensive, large scale kind of question. I mean, I know that there's, large scale monitoring efforts that some of them are ongoing. There's other things kind of in the works. It's probably good to not underestimate what it takes to monitor for years over, for animals that cover really large areas. But it would be, a long-term kind of monitoring multi-species ecosystem interaction study that had a nested component that looked at response to fixed things that you knew were or expected were going to be in place.
Great. Jeff, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to try to think interdisciplinary here and I basically agree with everybody else and just say, yeah, I think if we had tons and tons of money, I would fund some kind of state-of-the-art observational program that would capture, what everybody was talking about, right? Physical effects, birds and bats. I don't know if that's even possible, but and benthos and things like this. Basically, just a really big observational program. I think that would be nice to see.
Chris?
Yeah, I'd like to throw the book at all the different technologies and put them all out there and see what combinations work best in getting the right information that we need to assess or maybe predict risk and quantify risk. But at a smaller scale, I would just really love to have GPS tags that are small enough to put on small birds and bats and really get fine scale movement patterns for these animals that we can get for larger critters. I think that'd be really helpful to see that type of information.
Stephen?
Yes, I think what I would like to do, and I hope that's also what the Ventos group would like to do, that is to focus on, well, it is one of our top priorities, is to really focus on the impact of offshore wind farms on production and particularly reproduction. And that's including the enhancement of biodiversity, benthic biodiversity, because of this habitat provision and also the organic enrichment. And there is quite a lot of research already ongoing there, but I think that we're nearly there, so we better finish the job. And also not only the enhancement of production and reproduction, but also the risks that go, for example, with underwater sound, with the electromagnetic fields. I think that both of these topics are very important. And this then should ultimately lead to answering questions that we could call like so what questions, because in the end, it doesn't matter that much what happens around a single turbine, but it is about what happens to populations. And this is something that's clearly in the heads of people dealing with marine mammals, turtles, seabirds, bats as well, but not that much for people dealing with benthos. And I think that we have to also take that step. What does that mean? These food resources linked to production. Okay, well, what does that mean? Are we really going to have an increased production? What species are going to profit from it, and that sort of thing? It's a very wide question, and it probably kind of covers like half of our research priorities as we have identified them. But if we have an unlimited amount of money to spend, then we can do whatever we want to do as well. Don't we? Thank you.
Greg?
Well, I took a different perspective on your question. I was thinking that what you were asking was, of all the priorities, the different topics, which one? So I thought to myself, well, if I had just a limited amount of money, but I had to spend it in the right place, I asked myself, well, which of these different work groups had the feature or animal or group that was going to be impacted most, that I thought, by the wind farms. So I kind of went out on a limb there thinking, and this is kind of just a gut feeling, I'm kind of thinking that perhaps birds may be most impacted by wind farms, since they clearly have been impacted on land. And I think marine mammals may be impacted as well. And again, those are, I'm not trying to say nothing else is important, because that's not true. We're looking at, I thought of it in terms of a limited amount of money. You got to put it in the right place. So you got to kind of guess right. So I would think that perhaps either birds, marine mammals might be possibly impacted most significantly. And then I would just very pragmatically go to their prioritized list of projects and pick the top one or two. So that's how I approached it. They went rogue on this.
Sounds excellent. Angus?
Yeah, great to hear people want to throw money at birds. Yeah, I think I'd second a sort of interdisciplinary approach, and I think it'd be really interesting to build from the bottom up. So what's the effect on things like processes like sedimentation? How does that then feed through into the benthos and the sort of fish? And then ultimately, what are the consequences at population level for the sort of top predators, for the birds, for the marine mammals, for the turtles? How does it all sort of flow through, rather than just focusing on one group of taxa at a time? How does it all merge together?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're already a few minutes over our time today. Thank you all very much for presenting and providing your thoughts. This has been a really interesting conversation. So thank you all.
And thank you for organizing, Kate. You guys did a great job.
Yeah, you're welcome. So for everyone on the line, thank you for being here with us today. The webinar slides and the recording of this webinar are going to be posted on the eTwig website. We'll send out an email. And we also will send out an email when all of the 7 work group reports are finalized, which we're expecting will probably be in late June. So yeah, stay tuned. And hopefully you got a nice taste of some of the outcomes from the work groups today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.